Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Poetry Room. And for those of you online, welcome to you too. Thank you for joining us. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush people. It is always a privilege to be able to do so. So it is a delight to have Hannah Zeavin with us here because I think the last time we crossed paths was the pandemic. The book is called Mother Media, Hot and Cool Parenting in the 20th Century. It is, of course, published by our friends at MIT Press. And it's actually the winner of the Brooke Hindle Award from the Society for the History of Technology. And it tells the story of how our contemporary understanding of motherhood came to be and sort of examines 20th century norms around mediated mothering and technologized parenting. So Hannah is assistant professor of history and science in the Department of History and the Berkeley Center for New Media at UC Berkeley. She is the founding editor of Parapraxis, and in 2021 she co-founded the Psychosocial Foundation. So delighted to have with us Juliana Spahr as a speaking partner. She is, of course, a poet, a critic, an editor. She's the author of numerous volumes of poetry, fiction, criticism, and books co-edited with others. City Lights had the great pleasure of publishing her book, An Army of Lovers, with her collaboration with David Buke. So we will be having a Q&A towards the end of this. So for those of you online, you may also use the chat function to ask your questions. And for those of you here, please wait until I arrive with a microphone. We're going to be just having you raise your hand. But if you begin speaking, the people online won't be able to hear your question. So wait till I come to you with the microphone. We have an especially long cord tonight. So please join us in giving them a warm welcome.
How do you want to start? Do you have some things to say?
Hi, Juliana.
Hi.
Well, first, thank you so much for having me and thus us. I was telling Jessica and Juliana as we're walking over that the first time I came here was to deliver a message from Anne Waldman to Lawrence when I was like 16, and that's the coolest I've ever felt and probably the coolest I've ever been. And I love this room, so it's really nice to be here. Sure, I don't know. I can talk about anything related to the book or not. Lots to talk about, including the Warriors. The book, I mean, as was briefly mentioned, in some ways grew out of my first book, which I've hidden behind Juliana's book of poetry, which is the best book of poetry to come out in, I don't know, so long. It's so great. And my 5-year-old, who's now 6, steals it all the time because Juliana's his favorite poet, which pisses his dad off because his dad is also a poet. But you should buy Juliana's book. The first book is called The Distance Cure, and in some ways, Mother Media tried to backform it. The first book wants to think about what happens when you introduce media into a technologized dyad and become a triad. And at the end of that book, which was written during the pandemic, I arrived at this idea of the medium inside. The idea that actually we tolerate or don't tolerate what happens in technologized life, better or worse, based off of our early experiences with dropping, glitching, parents, or media. And so I thought I was going to write a book about mothers and children in media in a more psychoanalytic register. But I'm a historian, and that's not what I did at all. Instead, I began to try and write a book that's about why we feel so hateful towards mothers who dare extend themselves via media. And maybe if we are mothers, we might hate ourselves for it by handing their children an iPad or an iPhone. And I'm very interested in my work in things we've decided are socially bad and how that comes to be, not because they are bad or are good. Like, I don't think it's only awesome to hand my son an iPad, which I do all the time, but how that gesture becomes so culturally freighted and so understood to be bad that we sort of delete its history from the world. And that's what I tried to do in this book by looking at 100 years of mothers being told first that they had to be the only one giving care to their children, which is not how family life unfolded in the United States for just about anyone. And then secondly, what happens to mothers when they call technology in, whether in the form of the baby monitor or later the nanny cam or yes, Sesame Street and the tablet of today.
Great summary
Thank you.
of your book.
We aim to please.
Really excellent about it. I mean, I was trying to think about I had this it's one of many reasons to read this book. If you've ever had a child, you'll have very intense relationships with it potentially. And I kept thinking, there's the crying it out versus the attachment theory that you talk about. You don't mention it, but a variation on the binky or not.
Yeah.
There's whether these labor-saving childcare devices are for self-care or to return you to capitalism. That has to the bottle fed or not, that short window. I mean, there was all these things that I kept thinking about, these impossible decisions around mothering. And then there's this moment where you quote, is it Spock that says, "Trust yourself"? And I was just thinking about one thing that this book is about is why if you've ever had that moment in which you feel like I can't trust myself, or I don't know how could I possibly trust myself? I may put the baby down to sleep on its tummy if I was left to my own devices, or whatever these kinds of things are. And I was kind of and you put it on page 152 that there's this faulty relationship between mother and child that can have these dire consequences. And when I finished it, I kept thinking but where's the endless evidence? Because it's a history. And then one of the things that I actually thought, my next thought was I just read this book. I don't need to ask such a dumb question. Have you learned nothing from reading the book? Which is that the history shapes what sorts of evidence you're going to end up with in some way. I mean, you just said you give your child the iPad, but I still felt that question, is it okay to give a child an iPad? And maybe yes, because I wouldn't hesitate to give my child a cartoon, which is another thing that you talk about. Is it just the latest technology that we're always scared of, or how do we understand it?
Yeah, there's so much there. I mean, left to your own devices is right. That's why the devices come in. And the Spock thing, too, is very interesting. Spock, one thing that was funny about writing this book and then starting to talk about it is we really forget just how intensely disseminated parenting advice was. We don't live anymore in an unfractured media landscape. In fact, lots of my colleagues are working on just how highly fragmented and, put into cones people and the algorithms are separated from each other. And the parenting advice lives there, too. But Spock was the best-selling book of all time in the United States for a really long time outside of the Bible. And there are many versions of that. And Spock's book was updated something like 15 times. And of course, the first sentence does inaugurate this change in parenting, 1946. So everyone in this room was parented by someone who probably dealt with Spock pretty intimately. He became the gold standard. And the first sentence is, trust yourself, you know more than you think. And then there are 400 pages afterwards telling you how you shouldn't trust yourself. You should trust Spock. And this new form of parenting that was set up to unwind a really intensely and very popular in San Francisco form of parenting called scientific mothering that involved literally getting your baby weighed in public 6 times a week. Having, the shift away from breast milk to bottled milk because it was more scientific. That's where toilet training and also independent sleep come from. And then with Spock, there's this whole sort of change back, and I call it a fashion system following Roland Barthes, where it's just every time you have a binky, you will have a no binky. Mm-hmm. Every time you have this, you will have this other sort of antipode, because precisely it creates that kind of inability to self-trust. I'm not even sure that that's necessarily the most important thing. But so the book doesn't give any advice. It's not an advice book. It's an anti-advice book because it sort of wants to sit with the history of advice giving and just how both pernicious it can be. So much of the book takes place, yes, with individual mothers seeking care for, say, autistic children, but also moms negotiating the carceral state in upstate New York. We were also maybe going to talk about these other sites of mothering that are often ignored in histories of family for the clinic, or for the domestic, but they are sort of undergirding it the whole time. And so I didn't want to say, yeah, the iPad's probably okay or not. I'm not a psychologist. I don't spend time with that kind of empiric, but I do look at the history of them. So, it might be that the iPad and my media studies training is different. Oh, hi, Stephanie. Welcome. It might be that the iPad is different from the cartoons on Nickelodeon or whatever. I certainly prefer what happens on the iPad to Barney, which was the bane of my existence with younger brothers, and that song someone threatened to sing to me the other day. Oh my God. But that's, for me, not really the point. It's to look at how deeply ingrained that sort of self-hatred and other hatred is, because we've understood that mothers should do it alone. And all of the ways that gets freighted, and that the iPad is understood to undercut that. And we know it's an impossibility, to quote the thinker Emmy O'Brien, that we go it alone, right? That we know that is not actually the history of family life. And when people have to go it alone, really bad things happen in the form of, real isolation and pain. That is it for self-care or not?
Attachment parenting. Like that huge, giant pit of attachment parenting. And you tell this fascinating history around it, which was not a history I'd heard before. If you want to,
Sure.
talk some about that. That still feels like it's a very big issue, right? And
yeah, sure. So that was the other thing too, is that when the publisher says it's like this prehistory of how our contemporary understanding of mothering came to be, really it's like the ways that people think of themselves as following these sort of, again, fashion systems. Attachment parenting is one of them, where attachment parenting is not the same as attachment theory. There are at least 2 analysts in the audience. It has nothing to do with John Bowlby, but was understood as a kind of immersion parenting. And then the people who coined it realized that it sounded a bit like drowning a baby. And they're like, maybe not. Maybe that's a bad idea. And it was a Christian couple, one a kind of pediatric expert and his wife, who were interested in what would happen if there was a kind of return, a nostalgic return. And there's so much about the nostalgic return to a before time that never existed, but is fantasized after, often one that excludes media, and that puts ever-increasing primacy on a mother-child relation. And that's what attachment parenting seeks to do, although it's not just interested in the mother in really interesting ways. It wants the baby picked up. The baby's never to be on the ground, as all of these kind of prescriptive rules. But among them, and this is what I was so interested in, is it wants to get rid of all, from its contemporary moment, so the 70s and 80s, all of the available tools for parenting that had become mainstream and taken up. And there'd been so little renovation to the stuff of parenting from like the 1940s to that moment. So like the high chair is a technology from the late 1800s. The crib comes into vogue in 1900 when Watson says that babies should sleep independently and never be kissed so that they become strong, independent people. Now we think it's socially acceptable to kiss our babies, but for a while it was against sort of the parenting Bible of the time. And so attachment parenting goes sort of back that way. It wants to claw out the binky. It wants to claw out the stroller. And it's all about hypermediacy. It doesn't want any distance. So you can hear a little bit this register I was talking about before, where like, where's the distance in parenting was one of the first conceiving questions of the book. And at the same time, that's also when all of these mothers of that class are increasingly going back to work, working more. It's the glass ceiling moment. It's cultural feminism. And they're like, yeah, that totally doesn't work for my life. Not only do I have to have the child in a stroller, that child does have to be taken care of by someone else who is totally going to put it down because that person's looking after 20 children in a daycare. And so there becomes this whole other regime of sort of what I end up calling neo-scientific mothering in response that goes back towards the kind of hyper-regimented, get the baby down, get the baby up sort of school.
Right,
That is absolutely enmeshed in, the post-economic miracle, the downturn, and a real change in labor, which is always part of what's happening in parenting discourse and almost always disappeared from the scene.
Do you think that attachment parenting will become like a smother mother, that equivalent? Like, is it not a version of smother mothering that is kind of approved or some way?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. So Juliana's referencing in the third chapter of the book, I have this theory that then sort of becomes the subtitle of the book of hot and cool mothers. Hot as in MILF, sure, but also, which I learned yesterday in the UK is called yummy mummy, and I'm never going to be the same person. I'm like so ruined by having learned that, like so many things. But okay, at least here in the United States, a MILF, which I never thought I'd prefer to something else, but I do now. And also this kind of over-present, hyper-present, commanding, commandeering mother. And the earliest version kind of that's diagnosed is the smother mother. It comes from Leo Kanner, who is most famous in the United States for sort of evincing the new field of child psychiatry, but very shortly thereafter giving us the diagnosis called autism. And on the one hand, Kanner starts to think about all of the mothers in the Phipps clinic in Johns Hopkins. Hopkins is in Baltimore. The people in that clinic are not largely white, and yet he looks at a very small sample size of white children, all the children of his colleagues, and is like, aha, here's autism. I've a new diagnosis. All of their mothers are middle class and have some secondary, if not PhD level education. And it is their whiteness, it's their class, and it's their love of books. It's a particular attachment to media, to scienticity, that has come through their children like begetting like. And so he sort of has a theory of the cold mother. And on the other hand, he has the theory of the hot mother and her smothering, etc., smother mother, and he writes this really ridiculous thing about it. And he thinks it produces other kinds of quote unquote emotional disturbance, namely quote unquote homosexuality. And so there becomes this kind of, I don't think we've ascribed that to attachment parenting, like that it has particular outcomes, because I think we know better, but we also might feel culturally there's something off. Like it's too much, it's too much. Yeah. And we don't really think about what it necessarily does in those terms. A place I think there's a deeper pickup or related pickup is the helicopter mom. And we both teach college, and we have this sort of secondhand and firsthand knowledge of what the helicopter mom is because of how she's represented. I don't know if you've ever interacted with one who's like trying to get a grade change. I never have, right? I never have once in my 11, 12 now years of university level teaching. But we know that that's a phenom. And I think that's our neo-smother mother. And the attachment parenting, I don't know, but I think they're related.
The crib, the most basic of all your technologies, right? That gets constantly rewritten through these technologies. That was a really fascinating part of this, was like not only the one that Skinner develops where there's nothing in the crib, and then the one, the snooze, is that what it's called? The
snoo, the $1,000 crib.
Like what's going on there?
Well, sleep, we all know, we actually live again in a moment that's super obsessed with sleep. How we get it, that we don't get it. I don't mean to be looking at you, but this is like we've talked about, right? That there's this horrible, like, you know, if I don't sleep, then I can't go and produce myself. I have to reproduce myself to produce myself, and this kind of thing. But that tendency around children has been there for a long time, but it's really shifted. 150 years ago, the baby slept kind of whenever, and that was for most families understood to be okay. But then as labor got more and more disciplined, babies started to have to be, brought onto the clock. Even though they're not productive subjects, their parents sure are. And so as piecework stopped happening, et cetera, like we now have the adage sleep when the baby sleeps, and it used to be more work when the baby sleeps. And so that could be handled more loosely. And that's not been true for like 130 years. So there were all these ideas of how to get the baby to sleep better. One of them was co-sleeping, what's called now co-sleeping or sharing a bed. And as people became very worried about the other kind of smothering, the non-metaphoric smothering, or what we now call SIDS, and that, again, smothering, eventually SIDS became a legal question. People became very afraid, on the one hand, of that ultimate horror. Also, I'll just add, 130 years ago, we had very different feelings about children. And there's a beautiful book I love very much, a very painful book called The Priceless Child by Viviana Zelizer, which details kind of horrifically around life insurance for children when the child became priceless. 130 years ago, that process was just beginning. So that's part of the weirdness of doing family history. You're like, oh, right, we had different feelings about children, and whose children, and depending on where. So the crib comes out to represent this kind of ultimate ideal. The baby sleeps independently. You're not going to hurt it in its sleep, not going to kill it. That's good. I would say that's good. Like, right, that's something I'm happy to say is good. But then also the child, through that process, like iPads, I don't know, cribs, kind of into them. But then the child through that process is understood to take on all these different characteristics. And as I said before, one is independence and non-emotional interdependence with its mother, with its family. And that was seen as really good by the same guy who's like, don't kiss your kid. After sort of Watson begets Skinner, B.F. Skinner, most famous for his work on like lab rats, behaviorism. I'm seeing some nods, great. Skinner also was a family man. First in Indiana, then in Cambridge. He had more than one kid, and his wife was not too excited to have the second child. She was already like a faculty wife and had a life of her own and the kid. And so the two of them sat down and named all the things that were most shitty about early parenthood. And that included like laundry. It's like, it's gonna be no surprise. It's like the worst things for everyone, like laundry, etc. But they were also worried about these things like smothering, but entertainment, length of sleep. And Skinner figured out how to do it. He was like, first you make the baby cold. And we all know that like cold is supposed to help you sleep, but then you slowly raise the temperature and you can make a baby sleep 2 more hours this way. Are you taking notes? Then you have like nothing in the crib but a kind of optical toy up top so it doesn't interfere with smothering. And it can have its bottle and it can be naked. So there's nothing, or have a diaper only. And then you can hand crank the linen, which is my favorite part. And all of the cribs were hyper adjustable, and children were raised in them, basically like in them. They were taken out like 2 hours a day. And like all the psychoanalysts at the back just started making faces like, no, that's bad. But Skinner was vehemently attacked for this, and was said to be kind of mechanizing maternal love. And this is at the same moment as Spock is going, trust yourself, you know more than you think. And of course, there's this intense pull. Skinner looks like he's really on the side of like, raise your kid in a box. And indeed, that's what they eventually were pejoratively called, Skinner boxes, erroneously. And Spock is really loving. And then what happens if you look in the archive at Harvard is all of a sudden more and more parents want the air crib by Skinner, because all of a sudden the rates of SIDS is rising, like really, really rapidly in the nation. And later, public health historians and also public health officials now sort of assume that that's because Spock was telling everyone to put their babies on their stomach. And as I said, towards the top of the hour, it was the most widely read parenting manual ever of all time. And in the 90s, then suddenly we have the Back to Sleep campaign, where you're supposed to only put your baby on its back so it doesn't smother. And so the Skinner crib was like this early presage of like the safe sleep. And so I'm, again, even there, I'm like, I don't know, it sounds really weird. I wouldn't want one for Mally. But it also was really attuned to a very protective need for children by making it literally now how we prepare things like cribs and bassinets on the other side of the 90s, but like 30 years in advance.
I felt oddly seduced by it,
Yeah.
which is probably, I don't want to admit it, in some way.
I tried to buy one. Not, my child was too old, but I was like, this is an appropriate use of research funds. And they exist. They're just really expensive, and I love books so much. But
How much are they?
they're like on Etsy, you can find I'm not even kidding. I sort of hope that one day someone buys me one, because I'm never going to do it myself. But they're like $2,500 on Etsy. I've seen them. There are a few that still exist in the archives, and they don't look all that different in a way from a snoo. And of course, you could take your child out more than 2 hours a day. And there is someone who will still fabricate them for you. Because they got basically, like, now to use our contemporary parlance, shadow banned. And so people were like crowdsourcing, how do you make an air crib? This sounds really great. But Ladies' Home Journal said it would ruin your child if you did it.
Because they sleep too much, or because
it's from, like, what all these archival sources from their moment are saying, like, well, then you obviate the mother. Like, if she's not doing the laundry, these are all the gestures of care. And if you take them away, you're shaking this thing that I call the mother as medium, that really became the commandment of mothering across the U.S. in every related discipline, starting in the 1930s and I think to our present. And not crib as medium, which sounds great.
Among the many dystopic stories in this book is the reliance on women in prison, children in orphanages, to kind of establish a lot of these conventions in some way. Like, and I mean, were there certain things that get established out of that research? Like when they went and researched women who are prisoners, did that lead them to a certain series of presumptions about parenting that would have been like, does it take you away from mothering to cold or hot or cold, right? Or like, does that research, does the location change anything is kind of maybe the question.
Yeah, I think that's really immense. One way of answering that question is to say, why the 1930s and like not 1900 or 1895 and not like 1960? So like in 1895, we get Freud. Freud's like not very preoccupied with the mother, actually. This is a cultural mismemory. We go around thinking that like Freud would say like, and tell me more about your mother. And actually like not at all. But 2 generations later of psychoanalysts, he became very infatuated with the mother, in part because a number of them were mothers, right? They knew something about that early bond, and they knew something about the pre-Oedipal, and they knew something, but also like Winnicott, who is not a mom and never a parent. Also people like Ferenczi and so on, which those names may or may not mean anything to you, but this is this massive sea change in thinking like actually the mother is not just like the person who ostensibly gives birth, whether or not she does, but actually sort of controls everything else from there on. And so in the 1930s, that's happening, and also World War II is happening. And all of a sudden, there are all of these children. So there's a problem, right, with all this research. Is like, you asked about evidence. Where is the empirics? It's really hard, for good reason, to experiment on kids, right? Like, this has been it's a good problem, but it's a problem for the science. And so in 1939 to 1945, you have this hyper-vital window for these PSY scientists to do their research, because moms are separated from their kids in the London Blitz, and Anna Freud's over there with Dorothy Burlingame trying to figure that out. Renee Spitz, who I write a lot about in the book, is over here in the US, having emigrated from Vienna, working in the orphanages, but also in middle-class homes, but also in the prison. And he has this kind of comparative framework where he's trying to figure out what it is a mother does. And so in the normal middle-class home, mom's home all the time. In the orphanage, it depends. Sometimes the mom is never to come back. In his very famous film, Grief, the mother does come back. There's a very amazing intertitle, I think it's in my book, that says, Part 3, or The Cure, give the mother back to the baby, which is like the slogan of this era. And then in the prison, where that's deeply being co-negotiated with the warden, with, trying to figure out how to use the baby both as reward and punishment, as preventative against recidivism. And so in one way, like, yes, when we take attachment theory, not parenting now, the Bowlby stuff, quizzes on BuzzFeed, like all the empirics there really does come from delinquent kids in England. It comes from mothers in prison. That's just true. That's where the bulk of that research has happened, because what you're trying to do with such a theory, which I don't like, there are things I feel certain about, which I don't like because it's prescriptive and predictive. It's only interested in outcomes of children from this earliest moment. And I just think life is more complicated than that. And I believe that lots of factors matter. But it's looking at those earliest moments where you can control the mother-baby coming back together. So, Bowlby and Ainsworth's most famous test, the strange situation, where you take a baby away from its caregiver and go back and forth. You can watch the stuff on YouTube. It's kind of fascinating. Children react in all different kinds of ways. You can test children on that. You can get permission. That kind of separation and reunification is based off of the very scenes that occurred organically in the orphanage or were occurring under very pernicious circumstances in the prison. And that is this actuarial data, and it has all kinds of weird, shows up all the time. Yes, on BuzzFeed, am I securely attached? Am I anxious avoidant? What do you think? But also in things like our algorithms for whether or not people are allowed to get out of prison and at what time, and whether or not they're allowed to reunify with their families afterwards. And that's what that chapter tries to do, is look at the long life of that kind of data, where it comes from and where it ends up going.
I feel like I'll never look at one of those videos that show up on your feed about the animals being reunited with their children. Without I don't know, without with any sort of pleasure ever again.
I'm really sorry. I feel like that means I owe you like at least 12 beers.
You know, I mean, that was like what was really, it's really like so eye-opening in many ways, was like trying to think through these kinds of things that you're dealing with all the time. Like I had this memory of someone repeating this cold mother causes autism theory when my child was young, and even though I knew it was not true, that vaccines cause it, that's a joke. That
the iPad causes it, right?
iPad causes it. But I just remember being very anxious that like if I waited too long when he started crying, that he would end up autistic, or like that it was still like you can't get it out of your brain in some way. Like it feels so like hardwired into it. Which I don't know, maybe this is saying more about my own problems around it. But I don't know, I was just kind of thinking, the other thing that I'm thinking about is like all those videos around attachment parenting that feature people from third world countries. Oh, yeah. That kind of like show up as like the real mothers, the mothers uncorrupted by technology, essentially, yeah. Whose babies never cry because they've figured this thing out or something. And
the baby that never cries is also apparently something to worry about too, right? Like you really can't win.
Right, yeah, it's true. You have to spank them and pinch them when they come out first. So like it's the mother as metaphor, but the metaphor is like so slippery and all over the place in some ways. And it's that kind of question, like I guess if there was, this might be the part where you're kind of like, this is not an advice book, but where it leads you eventually usefully is to begin to think like, a lot of these things I can give up, or a lot of these things I don't have to really spend hours arguing with my partner about whether we should bottle feed or not, because he wants to feed him with the bottle, right? Like you just don't have to like those kind of have like a different answer to them, which is they have this history, and the history may not be helpful or something.
Yeah, I think that would be for a reader who's a parent or a new parent or a parent at all, because I think a lot of this stuff sticks with you even after you're out of the conversation of like how to sleep train or not. Mm-hmm. Because then it's forever, did I do the right thing, right? This stuff really is indelible, and you're not at all the only person who's like constantly hearing some weird Greek tragic chorus of like every mashup of every parenting book going through your head. At least there are two people apparently up here with that experience. But I think it's to say like, look, there are certain things to really watch out for. And this is where the book ends. It has I think I like this strange coda form. Where I really wanted to begin to think about, like, if on the one hand there's this media theory of mothering, that mother has to be prime, is the only, sole conveyance, you cut the umbilical cord, and of course all of the assumptions that these scientists are making include biological mothering, include exclusive mothering, include classed and raced and deeply questions of sexuality as well. But like that any time there's a kind of emphasis on purity, watch out. And that's one thing that comes up again and again. The idea that a mother should or can mother for herself and alone is terrible. And I try and lay out the sort of social pressures to do so. One thing that was really shocking to me in acquiring the field of the history of the US family was that one of the ways suburban life was sold was to get away from your parents and your in-laws so that you could set the rules for your kids, right? Apart from the last generation. And thus people willingly walked out of institutional, like helped like structures of intergenerational family life and care, which to me seems wild to put it bluntly. So like that kind of thing. So any kind of like purity, or it should only be this, it should only be that. And the way it ends is with the most extreme version of that, which is like fascistic parenting, where purity is the watchword. And so there's hyper nostalgia correlating with hyper purity, and the idea that, yes, actually 3 things are fungible. Mother as impure, conveyance of care, putting the wrong thing into the child, the screen, and sort of like media as it comes into the home that you can't control. Like your kids will learn stuff on YouTube. That's true. You may or may not ideologically agree with it. And 3 things like vaccines. And that they're all actually following the same path. And it's a little sticky because by the end of the book, I've like basically shat on at one point or another every single form of parenting style, which I'm like, see, everyone gets their turn, I promise, myself included, and the things I'm attached to. But the place I start there is with the Waldorf schooling and its history, starting in Germany, and looking through all of the ways it's been very, very attached to racial purity, maternal purity, anti-vaccination, and so on, long before like, quote unquote, our contemporary moment with like RFK and stuff. But absolutely there. And there's this one, for me, it's like the most devastating, in a way, like short archival story I found, because it's just so strange. Like, right, obviously there's much more brutality in the book elsewhere. The kind of shock of this, that a Waldorf kid had his tonsils out, which was like de facto in 1972, and was wheeled out of the surgery and into his hospital bed, and they wheeled in the TV, and he started screaming. Which, if you can imagine screaming after having a tonsillectomy, is insane, because he was taught like the TV was the equivalent of, I don't know, the devil. And I think like those moments where we're like so sure the iPad is the worst thing, rather than the missing, to borrow Helen Sharman's term, mother state that would, help mothers, or the missing intergenerational care or community around kids, such that we don't actually have to pass the screen. Not that the screen is the worst thing in the world. I think that's part of where the book tries to end up.
We should take questions, but I just want to point out one thing that I found and learned in this book, which is that Noguchi designed the first baby monitor, which is, I think, fascinating. But do other people have questions?
Thank you, Juliana. Yeah, while you're passing around, the Noguchi baby monitor is gorgeous. That's another thing I've looked for on the internet. Haven't found one. I think they're all in archives. But it was designed as a response to the Limburg baby kidnapping. And so that's the other thing I think has been missing from our conversation, but I hope isn't missing from the book, because I think it's right there in center, which is so much of these interventions are made for the hyper wealthy and then get sold to everyone as like, they get quote unquote downstreamed. Like everyone needs a baby monitor, when like I definitely had a baby monitor, and I could have heard my baby through the one wall downhill from Lucy's house. I'm sure Lucy heard the baby, no baby monitor. You thought it was cute? Thank you. You're the best neighbor ever. I feel like it's class. You can call in Charles.
Thanks so much, and I'm sorry I came in a little late for class. I wondered, so when I've delved into like the history of the American family in the 20th century and kind of this child rearing advice, one of the things that's hardest to disentangle is kind of who it's reaching, and it feels like the advice of like, don't kiss your baby. It's like, how many people in 1895 were actually not kissing their babies as a result of that advice? I think some, but the kind of the penetration of these expert discourses through media, like it really changes over time, it feels like. And today I feel much more confident that that advice is getting through because everyone's on TikTok or something. But I wondered,
Watson on TikTok is a new thing I'm going to have a nightmare about, so thanks so much.
But yeah, one thing I guess I'm curious, like, if you're really following these expert discourses at some level, what's your sense of how much they're actually reaching the general population over time, and how is that happening? Like, is it happening through the school, through kind of health agencies, through doctors? Something like Dr. Spock obviously reaches a lot of people, but not everyone's even reading that book, even if it is a huge bestseller. Like, it's not getting to everyone in the 50s. So
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a few things there. One is I totally agree that 1895 and say 1913 are really different. And when Watson's manual comes out, it's disseminated in books. So like there are fewer options, so there is a bigger audience. The other is the amount of serialization of these books, which was a major thing I tried to trace, like for my own benefit, because I had this question too. It's like, just because someone says they're an expert and they're famous to me now as a historian of the thing doesn't mean individuals were engaging, reading, or taking it in. But first of all, like the sheer number of copies does tell us something. I buy books I don't read. I know that. I have so many books. But, right, they uptake the others through pediatricians' offices. And the other is a big question about class, which is to say, like, okay, the very mothers Kanner was identifying, he was identifying because they were very much of a class of people who was very engaged with the parenting literature, i.e. Watson specifically. But scientific mothering, right? There are more and more studies being like by historians, great historians, including a PhD candidate in our department, Lydia, who's fantastic, about like, say, the San Francisco scientific mothering communities and the door-to-door knocking. So you may or may not have known the name Watson, but you're being disseminated the advice. And you're being told you're a bad mother if you didn't come weigh your child. Right? And so there are these moments of like literally in the neighborhood surveillance, social workers, and this kind of permeation. So I think it's happening at multiple registers and like in multiple sites. And then, you know, never underestimate the greatest technology of all time, which is peer-to-peer shame. Right? This is another actually really important place that this stuff passes through. And we often see those stories when women get together and collectivize and decide to do something different, where we can see like just how much women are talking to each other. And it's not all women, obviously, and not all the time. But like La Leche League, the kind of return of breastfeeding, happens because a group of Catholic moms are sitting like on a grassy knoll outside of church and they're like, man, why is breastfeeding so hard? It's just come back into vogue thanks to Spock, right, a little bit. And then it's like this national, right? There are all those moments. So I think there's that. And the last thing I'll say is like circulation of Lady Home Journal is pretty big, but also like all kinds of women's magazines. And Cornell has an amazing archive, not just like the deepest set of sourcing, but also its circulation numbers. And they were not small. Thanks, Charles, and thanks for coming.
So I've got something from online. Alexis was commenting on something you said earlier, so I don't know, it's out of context now, but I think it was bringing up the idea of misogyny and how deeply rooted it can be, and also thinking about the rise of the bourgeois family, the dream of the family unit being self-sufficient, father, public, mother, private. Do you also review the kibbutz?
I don't. There are some more communal forms of living. This book is a U.S. history, pure stop. I was trained first in American studies, so I always think of the U.S. in empire. And of course, the U.S. has very intense empiric relations with Israel. But I stay very much within the confines of the U.S. The kind of more communized life I look at is really only towards the end. And it's the flip side of the kind of Waldorf panic. I look at the Move family in Philadelphia up until the moment where they're murdered by the Philadelphia police. And their deep investment in non-mediation as a counter, which is like to say, if we have a kind of association of purity with fascism, what happens when the purity is actually as a kind of militant leftist, like, don't let the state into my family. And there are kind of eerie sort of resonances, but I really wanted to think through them. But yes, misogyny, yes, deeply ingrained. I often get asked the question when I talk about particularly the psychologists, because there's also like all this stuff on Sesame Street and the history of early childhood education by distance and whatever. But when I talk about the psychologists, people are like, where's the good news? And I'm like, not so much, because it is, even in the kind of feminist answers to some of these theories, we don't actually get, kind of tragically, that far. There's still a lot that's taken as granted, like, for instance, exclusive mothering.
Thanks, Hannah. Yeah, this I have a bunch of questions. I'll try to sort of synthesize it into one. So I guess the nature of my question is to ask, like, if one of the projects of this book is to kind of decenter the mother in our understanding of early childhood and child psychology. I was thinking when you were talking, the figure of mother media, both as like a kind of like a personage, but also as media, it seems to like run through a couple of different shared problem spaces. So one is the problem space of proximity and distance, right? One, which you touched on sort of at the end of the conversation with Juliana, was this idea of surveillance. And the other is desire, right? And sort of the kind of figure of both the mother and mother media as sort of an object, a kind of desired object by the child for various things. So how I mean, is that part of the project? Like, should we, like, is kind of like is there a kind of I don't want to say like a crude, or like a kind of like reductive economism to a story of mother media as technology, about the kind of automation of motherhood, or like the failed promise of the automation of motherhood, how we should think about that. And the second question I have is about red diaper babies, and I wanted to know if they appear at all in your story too, because it does kind of. I was kind of thinking in the back of my head when you were talking about where you end the book, that's sort of a book that's not, it's sort of a book, it seems to me, I haven't read it yet, that's neither about a kind of return to this sort of like natalist movement style of the politics of purity, pure mothering, whatever, pure family. But it's also not a kind of reactive critique of technology, but it does seem maybe that there's a kind of plea for the social in there somewhere. And so I just wonder kind of where that goes.
Yeah, second first, yes. I think plea for the social is nice. Red diaper babies are super fascinating to me. I'm married to one. I know many of them. I guess de facto I'm raising one. And there are a few nice histories of communist childhood in the United States. One is called Raising Reds, which is such a good book title. And yeah, so there are, I think, like 2 citations to that book. I tried to stay really far away from some things that would call in me. The book stops. I mean, I gesture to the SNU and I gesture to the iPad, but it really stops in the 1980s. It stops with Neil Postman for the media heads in the room, in part because I think language of media effects and maternal effects are like most crystallized in that moment and then disappeared. So media effects, the idea that a medium is doing a thing to me, like the TV is, according to the 1960s, making me bug-eyed, and my mother is making me emotionally disturbed. Not really, Mom, don't worry about it. And those things actually come from the same place, media research and psychological research, and they're much closer together than we think. And then the question before about like the failure of automated mothering, the desire for it, right, is a really complicated feminist history to thinking about different arrangements that might alleviate forms of reproductive labor. So some of the goats in my field have written beautifully about this, whether it's Dolores Hayden, who's written a beautiful book on feminist experiments with architecture, thinking very much of the communal kitchen. So like the colon tie for the communists in the room, right? Like kind of idea of like what would happen if we collectivized all this stuff. Would things indeed get better? Compared to the private nuclear home is like a great Dolores Hayden book, but also the book that's most clearly the predecessor in some ways is Ruth Schwartz Cowan's book, More Work for Mother, which, if you don't know it, I so highly recommend it. Really tracks the American family from the late 1800s to through the 1970s to think about how not sort of exclusive mothering, but exclusive housewifery happens. So we have this idea that for time eternal, quote unquote, women have forever done all the domestic work and quote unquote, men haven't, and children were always precious. And she really destabilizes that by like taking a composite case of an American family and watching how all of a sudden the labor burden shrinks down to mother. And thus technology are presented as this way of ameliorating. So giving her back a husband and a kid, giving her a helper in the home. And if you remember the title of the book, I suggested not really, because it's more work for mother, right? It's a great slogan. And I found that too, that there's a lot of excitement and wish for like, what would it do if I had the baby monitor? For the family that gets no Gucci to design it, it's so that the wife can be down one end of the yacht, entertaining, playing cards with her husband while they have guests over during the Great Depression, and down the other end, baby can be sleeping, right? That's a desire. It might not be one you or I can super relate to, but that was a desire about extending the universe of that family down one end of the yacht, I repeat. There are much more quotidian and relatable examples of that. And sometimes they work, and most always people are punished for them, right? Like the children who grow up in the quote unquote Skinner boxes are universally as a class labeled freaks, even though we have the documents over at Harvard showing us that their parents really loved it, the children loved it, and they all grew up to be quote unquote well-adjusted, if that's what we're going for. Thanks, Matt.
Just from earlier, was that Isamu Noguchi? For who designed the Isamu? That was
The
Isamu?
sculptural.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have a real question, but I was just wondering.
Yeah. I want to, I'm like, I have it here. Like, we could do show and tell. I should have brought a slide
cool.
deck. Then I could show you Andy Warhol doing It's 10 p.m. Do you know where your children are? It looks like this. I won't leave any finger smudges in the book, I promise. No, I know. Mom, you have a copy of the book at home. It's on page 61.
Nice. Okay, so my real question was, so another thing other than scientific parenting that's popular in the Bay Area is having two moms, of which, and I'm one of the people who does, and so I was wondering, kind of in the models, like as it relates to Marshall McLuhan and the hot and cold, that sort of comparison to Marshall McLuhan's media theory, and also the strained situation. Like, is it a situation where if you have two mothers, things heat up, right? Because the mother is a medium. Just how does that factor in? Or like when you have a situation where usually the caregiver in the strained situation experiments, the caregiver is usually, maybe always, the mother. I'm not sure if there are situations when it isn't.
It's always the mother.
Yeah, so in that case, would they bring in both mothers? Or would they decide that one is the real mother? Mm-hmm. I'm just kind of, because when I read this, I'm always wondering, how does this map on? Kind of, kind of narcissistically.
No, yeah.
So
Totally.
that's my question.
Great question. So to go to the McLuhan moment, which is this kind of Canner sets up this hot and cool mom typology. McLuhan's doing a similar thing over in media. I make something of that. At that moment, like 40s, 50s, 60s, right, there is the lavender scare. So there's a lot of worry about what queerness generally is doing, and the thing to avoid, one of the few, there are a number of outcomes. High taxonomies. There's like a little image, I think, in the book of like a list of the things that moms shouldn't do. And there's basically a corresponding list of, but if you did do them, here's what we think you'd produce. And one of the most feared outcomes is the queer child, the trans child, the autistic child. And so I'm looking at these really pernicious theories that are hypernormative, right? They're not just prescriptive, they're hypernormative. And they're in the aftermath of World War II, where the draft had just done all this surveillance. of men who were found not always to be straight and therefore dishonorably discharged, and this idea that the US had to like prevent this from happening again, not just queerness, but also all of the people who weren't allowed to serve due to quote unquote mental illness and all this stuff. And so there's not that much caring or engagement with the non-normative family because it's already an image, a fantasy of a normative family that's already doing the work of standing in for all kinds of difference. So like, no, not 100%, we know this stuff, right? Like not 100% of people lived in the suburbs with a mom and a dad and 2.2 kids. And I always point out that even the 0.2 shows us like how silly and ridiculous this is. But queer moms were part of this group of hypersexualized moms. And that is often the history of lesbianism. I was having a conversation yesterday with Helen Sharman, whose book I referenced earlier. She's a great book called Mother State. And it's about the UK and the Margaret Thatcher moment in large part, and how the state first comes in to do the work of mothering and then is rescinded at the same time as Thatcher and Thatcherism rejects it. And she was saying it's very similar in the UK too, that that's like the a priori most sexual mother and therefore falls on the, unfortunately, right, all of this with the blinking sign, I hate everything I'm saying, going off over my head, falls on the hot side of mothering. And that also shows up in the prison too, where those prisons are often a women's prison that in the history of New York is often around sexual deviancy in various ways, including sex work, but far from exclusively.
Is there ever anything designed, any sort of media to replace the father, like a wire cage?
Yeah, I need a minute. Yeah, so I was trying to think about that when I first got going on this. Like I had this research area, but I came up with this hypothesis that these two things were interrelated. The radio was understood to be hyper dad form, and it was the last media form that was really understood as such, like father of the nation, kind of masculine broadcast coming in. It's very different in the UK actually, because the BBC is called Auntie and was always kind of feminized in this way, especially after World War II. But after that, the sort of law of the father being piped in sort of drops off and stops, because I think it came from the part of Alexis's question at the beginning, over online, right? The dad is understood to be doing what he needs to do somewhere else. And sometimes is like weekend warrior dadding. But that's not where any of the scientific research is very interested, though it had started there, right? Very much like what is the role of the father is like one of Freud's great questions from his self-analysis. And the next generations were less and less and less interested. So someone does need to write the like really all-time great cultural history of the dad in the US. I don't think it totally exists yet.
Like the dollar bill.
Sorry?
The dollar bill.
Yeah.
Commodity.
Yeah, the commodity is your dad.
Is this the end? Are there any other questions, or you want to take a hand for Hannah's great book,
And
which is
Juliana's.
lovely, and I highly recommend reading it.
And because we're in the poetry room, Juliana's book is both here and right there on the edge. And don't sleep on it. Thank you, Juliana. Thank you,
thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you, City Lights.